Hello, my name is Charlie Hank with the Historical Committee. The Historical Committee is conducting leadership recall interviews of past society leaders to document their comments as part of our centennial celebration. This morning we're privileged to have with us Andrew Boggs, who is the Executive Vice President Emeritus of Society. Good morning, Andy.
Good morning, Charlie.
Andy, I'd like for you to start off this morning with a little discussion of your background and how you got involved with ASHRAE.
Okay, Charlie. It is a little different from some of the ways that you might get into your lifetime career, so it would probably be of interest. I was in World War II, and when I came back out of service, I had to go back to school at Norwich University, the oldest private military college in the country, to finish my degree in chemistry. It sounds easy, but when you have 4 years broken in the middle of a curriculum of that type, I really had to try to learn 3 years and then another fourth year, which was not at all that great. But it did work, and I did get through. While I was there, in determining what I might do for my lifetime career, my ex-boss at the Edison Electric Institute in New York City wrote me a note and said that there had been a great development in the application and development of heat pumps during World War II, and the utilities had a joint committee, a national committee, that were studying this and thought that I might like to be the first secretary. It seemed easier at that time, as you would expect, to quickly say yes and go back to an organization that you knew, the people you knew, the route home to office, and the whole works. So I did say yes. And fortunately for me, that helped me get into this function with ASHRAE. While there, I became a member of ASRE because refrigeration was being developed, particularly in those days, in the application of ground coils, water coils, health, hospital applications, and the whole wealth of what had developed as a necessity in World War II was now becoming part of the industry. While I was at EEI, fulfilling my activities there, I also grew to know the people in the American Society of Heating and Air Conditioning Engineers, which had been heating and ventilating, and had changed their name to air conditioning, as well as ASRE, the refrigeration end of the business. And in looking at the monthly journal, I saw an ad where somebody needed a technical secretary, which is what they called people in that field in those days. And I said, well, gee, that's what I do now. Maybe I should talk to them. And I did, and I didn't talk much. It was over lunch, and then I said yes. And so that's really how I got into the part of my life that became ASHRAE. At the time I joined ASRE as a staff member in 1955, there was already a great deal of talk between the refrigerating engineers and the air conditioning engineers to combine the two organizations. There was an overlap, perhaps 30% overlap of membership, for one thing. Another thing, that both organizations had gone into air conditioning. It seemed a little strange to have two groups working together and yet pushing against each other. And although they had tried for a number of years to merge, something always came up where one or the other organization did not vote for it. This time they did, and in 1959 the two organizations merged and became ASHRAE. Now, it was a wild time there when we had a committee who tried to decide what name would we give this new animal, because ASHAE did not want to lose any of the letters, nor did ASRE. And that's how we came out with ASHRAE and the hexagon, which was a very smart idea. At the time, it seemed unwieldy, but it was not, and it's worked very well.
Now, with the merger, I know there's still people who talk about it was bad to have that happen because refrigeration got lost in the society over the years. Can you comment on a little bit about that?
Well, that's at the time of the merger, that's true, Charlie. But even worse were those who were experts in thinking so much about ventilation, because you note there's no V. Right. And the real theory was that air conditioning, of course, incorporates all of them. That doesn't set too well with people who said, yeah, that's fine for the big group, but not for me because I specialize in that field. So we started off a kind of rocky path, but little by little, and the chapters also merged, where there were more than one, eventually, and it's made it stronger. And today, of course, as you know, we're growing more than probably any other technical organization in the engineering field.
Also, initially, I believe the officers of each of the organizations did like a 6-month term?
First year.
First year. Oh, first year, okay.
Whichever one was in there from each group just took over 6 months, and then we came into the fold. And since that time, of course, it's been just the regular mechanics of it. Unfortunately, it's a new president every year for me.
Right.
And so over 30 years, I had to get to know the foibles of different people.
Well, why don't you describe then some of the things that had happened to you over your 30-year career with ASHRAE, starting off with 1955 or 59 and continuing on.
All right, fine. One thing was that our first thing we had to do was to have our own journal for this new group. So we quickly got together a masthead and whatnot of a rough journal, which for about 6 months was little more than a report of what we thought was going to happen. And then it, too, evolved. And as you know today, it's a very, very worldwide known journal of our field. At that time, too, at the merger, the new engineering center in New York City up by the UN was being planned. And so each of the engineering organizations were asked to support that. So we immediately, after the merger, started off with a fund drive, which was a little difficult too. But we had strong members of the society in charge of the committees, and they did, in fact, complete our commitment, and we were able to move into our new center. And that was in 1961. We had a staff at that time of 40 people, which is a far cry from the over 70 professionals we have today in Atlanta.
I hope that later we'll talk about the move to Atlanta. You mentioned now moving from our present location in the 60s to the engineering center. Later on we can discuss the move to Atlanta when you get to that.
Well, let me just hit some of what I think are the significant things that happened to the industry and to the society over those 30 years that I was there. The ASHVE had a research laboratory in Cleveland. I'm sure that many of the listeners knew of that. But with the merger, the commitment to an expanded area of different types of research could not be accomplished in that smaller laboratory. So we decided that we would disband that and use our research funds in private cooperative research projects, generally with the academic field. Many of the large universities had excellent research facilities And to this day, this is how our money is spent. The two societies each had a handbook. The ASHPE guide, of course, was known throughout our mechanical field ever since the beginning of ASHPE in 1894. The ASHRAE data book was widely known in our industry, primarily in the refrigeration area. So one of the original things that we did after the merger was to put these together to see how we could merge that and spread out, give us more room to give more technical information to all of these areas. The first approach was to merge these into the first ASHRAE handbook. And it was a 3-volume series, part ASRE and part ASHAE. This, of course, has grown today, as you know, to a 4th volume, and there are even thoughts of expanding that work of the society. Give you some little idea of how the total society was growing. In 1968, we charted the 105th chapter, and we recognized the 18th International Associate. For years, we had had established a program where we worked with the same kind of organization as ASHRAE, except in the countries throughout the world. And we happen to call them International Associates, just so it has some sort of an umbrella. But that too grew. In 1968, our membership was over 23,000. And of course, we thought that was tremendous, and it was at that time. But our over 50,000 at the present time, of course, makes it look rather small. So we've grown in all aspects of the operation. One of the things that the society began to really develop and work on was the various standards necessary for the industry, various aspects. And one of the big ones, of course, was the energy conservation in new buildings. There was a big thrust by DOE, government organizations, and other research groups to develop some sort of standard for that field. And we had committees that worked for several years. And this culminated in 1975 into our well-known Standard 90.
I guess the impetus for that originally was really the first oil embargo that the United States faced in '72, I believe it was.
Yes.
They really pushed that hard.
Yes. And, of course, that's why even today we're much more concerned than we were then on what could happen.
Right.
Our energy conservation feeling is now kind of universal. Everybody believes in it. When the oil was flowing free, it was a little different. It was difficult to do research in certain areas because people thought, well, why do that? Now we know. In 1977, a program was reestablished that had been dropped several years before because of inactivity, and that was our student branches. We had made attempts to start that, but unless you had a professor who was really interested, or might even be a member of the society, it just didn't work. And the major educational agencies didn't want another student activity at that time. They already had several majors already developed. In other words, ASME, the older societies, civil engineers, had already for years had whole departments at their headquarters who did nothing except develop student branches, or whatever they happen to call them in their field. But again, because of the tremendous development over those years in the 70s in human comfort, indoor air quality, different approaches for different problems in the refrigeration, air conditioning fields, the schools once again became interested. However, the schools don't come to us, Charlie. we go to them. And that meant that we had to have this interest develop within the society. The chapters were the ones who pushed for these student branches and the ones who oversee them. So the tremendous increase in this is really a boon, not only to the society, but to those new younger members when they come out of school who have been student members frequently, of course, come right into the society. And one of the major things, I think, for several years, of course, was that we were getting crowded in our space in the Engineering Center in New York. And there was no hope for them, even though original plans had included it, but there was no hope for them to build a second tower. We had to move because we were expanding. And for that reason, a committee was set up to determine what city in the country would be best for ASHRAE. And we rapidly cut out certain cities that didn't have what characteristics we wanted. We wanted a town that had a way of life that the staff particularly would enjoy. They had to have a good transportation system so that people could get to work, so that our friends coming in from the airports and whatnot would be able to come to the headquarters and see us. Or for meetings. We wanted a place where they had a good educational system. One or several universities available. Libraries. All of these things that mean so much to each of our lives. And climate. We wanted it to be not too harsh. In other words, we didn't want to go way up north or way down south, or what have you. And the committee quickly just chopped off people, different towns. We had been in New York ever since we were founded, so that they felt it was going to be too expensive for us to stay in New York. So we cut New York off. And one by one, we went around as a committee and visited all of the other cities and talked to their mayors, Chamber of Commerce, took trips to see what kind of buildings were available, rates of rent or purchase, and again, cranked all these things. We gave them numbers, reported. Each one would have a certain 1 to 4 number, put it into a computer, pressed a button, and got an overview of each of these prospective cities. And interestingly enough, it came down to Atlanta and Dallas. I think the one that probably pushed it toward Atlanta was a little bit of local transportation. Dallas it's a great university town, medical, research, churches, the whole thing. Weather's a little harsh sometimes in the summer. It gets a little warm. And people forget that they say, well, Atlanta gets hot too. Well, Atlanta is not on the coast where people think it is. It's 200 miles inland. So that it doesn't have too many bad days. Little humidity. July and August can be rough. And they have their one winter storm. In January, they have one day there's some snow or ice. And I think they have one snow plow, so which gives you an idea of how much need they have for it. But we did finally decide on Atlanta. And the next thing was to look around for a building. And we found a building that was convenient to transportation, the size we needed, in reasonably good shape at that time, and big enough for expansion. And we're still there, although we've done a great deal of renovation in the last couple of years.
Major renovation.
Major renovation, yeah. Well, if we were going to tell people about indoor air quality, we better have our own place up to our standards.
Exactly.
And so we did that. And it's been a major improvement. It's Atlanta's growing too, as you know, so that we are becoming now, our headquarters right on the main road, and it's right there so you can go any place. And in 17 minutes you could be at the airport in their mass transit, which is a big boon because like any major city, Atlanta has its problems downtown too. I think the same time that we purchased a building in 1981, we also decided that we needed a Washington office, not the lobby. A lot of people think, well, if you have a Washington office, you're down there lobbying. It's not that at all. It's a technical support unit for the different staffs in the government. Dr. Cox goes up on the Hill, and it's rare that he would even see anybody like a senator or representative. They're going to see somebody who is running the operation for those people, and they have a problem. The main thing is to let them know what our society is doing in certain fields that they might be interested in. And it's been very successful. It's grown now. He has a professional helper to write on the standards that are being developed by the government. And of course, many of them are based on ones that we have proven to them that work for the industry. So it's a great liaison, but not a lobbying effort.
I think you're right. It's been very successful, and I think the government is now drawing upon ASHRAE's expertise to help in developing these national standards.
And a lot of people, of course, are well aware that for several years, many organizations and government have been working on this indoor air quality, because that's one of the primary missions today of all of us, is to make sure the indoor air quality is proper for the people who are working there. You know, you spend most of your day in a building. So we've got to make the inside better quality than the outside, or we haven't gone very far. And in 1982, we published the ASHRAE position statement on indoor air quality. And I was just letting the world know what the society is doing in that field. Then our standard series on energy conservation in existing buildings, on which we have been working for several years. They were finally published and much needed by the industry, and certainly helpful to the different government programs that DOE was establishing at that time. One of the areas of interest that may not be too well known is what we've done outside the normal working area of society in their chapters and regions. In 1984, a large group of American engineers in Singapore, in our field, approached the society on becoming a chapter. And as a matter of fact, they became the first, what we called, chapter at large. And that's later that same year, an even greater number in Hong Kong, as you might expect, also was chartered as a chapter at large. And just recently, our sixth chapter at large was chartered in Saudi Arabia. So you can see how this whole thing just is expanding. And of course, that means more people. They don't stay over there at these places for life. They are moving around all the time. And young people here, after they're educated, go to these different areas. And particularly Hong Kong and Singapore have been very big. And you know what's happened not too long ago in Saudi Arabia, right, and why they need refrigeration particularly. Then in 1985, one of the things that all major companies and organizations like ASHRAE was finally adopted, our strategic plan, looking out to the future, making commitments in different areas so that we can improve and expand our services to what we call humanity in all of these different areas. And that has been extremely successful. And one of the things that I like, because I worked so hard way back on it, was the fundamentals volume of our handbook series. We had a lot of questions from people in other countries where they use the metric system, which we're supposed to be using, by the way, and been approved for years, but the engineers fight it. It's a tough, unless you grew up that way. Oddly enough, I used the metric system because that's what I had in chemistry, and so chemists had no problem. But a lot of them don't like it. But in order that our first approach was to let's put the handbook out, and every time there's a statement of some measurement in English units, in parentheses following it, we'll put the metric units. And that was, you can imagine what that, you go through a handbook and try to plug these things in parentheses, there were problems. Every time you do that, there's just more chance for an error.
Right, sure.
Finally, in 1985, we published a separate volume of the handbook. There's one in metric and one in English. So that all you do is check off which one you want, and that's the one you get. But it's very popular, and the metric, you'd be surprised, particularly when we have major meetings of the society. We get a great many visitors from all over the world, and they're always, well, first thing you do is go to our bookstore. They want the books, and they like the idea that we are considering helping people throughout the world by printing it in metric units. And that was done the year I graduated, sure. In the year I retired, and much has happened even since then. So I'm very pleased that, to see how this organization has developed since I first started 37 years ago. And I think the next 37 or whatever will show just as much progress. Our chapters are working diligently. We have committees working on every aspect. And it's just surprising when you come to major meetings in a hotel and to develop enough meeting space, not for an exposition, that is generally pretty easy, but for committee meetings. And when you tell the person from the hotel, well, let's see now, we need 100 committee meetings Monday morning. And they smile, because if they haven't had that type of what they call convention, they can't imagine it. Then we try to tell them that this is not really a convention, it's a technical meeting. And yes, we do need 100 committee meetings Monday morning.
I'm sure it's quite a shock to the hotel to hear that. Like you say, they smile and think you're kidding them, right? Can you tell us a little bit about your relationship with all the society presidents over the years that you were involved?
Well, one thing is, of course, that, again, we're a little different from some of the technical organizations. Our president never spends 1 or 2 years on the board of directors and then becomes president. He probably has served a minimum of 7 years on the board, plus several years in the region or his chapter level. So these are all background. They all have the background before they become the administrative leader. And by that time, they had been able to develop their theme and what they want to accomplish in that 1 year. The fun I had was looking and working with these different persons every year, but whom I had known for a number of years. So it was a matter of, on such and such a date, when one president goes out at the banquet and another one comes in, it's just a matter of a different approach. By that time, the staff has known what kind of approach that's going to be. Now, there's no big shock. There's not that much of a change, but people do approach things in different manners. And part of my job and other members of the staff was to determine what those differences happened to be so that we could smoothly make that transition. Plus, they're all friends of mine, and it's just amazing. And some of the interesting things, you know, one of the happenings that hit me many years ago, but when I first, it must have been in the late 50s, just after I had really gotten going. We had an older man, he was in his 90s at that time, in our field. And he had been must have been about the third president. In 1912, he was president of ASHRAE. And he was well known in the industry, had an office down in Wall Street area, lived up in the West Side in New York. And here he is at 90 and 92, jogging every morning from his apartment down to his office in Wall Street. So jogging did not start in the last decade. It started many years ago. And he would also then jog.
That's amazing.
To come into the library and talk to us. It was fun because here was a giant. And we were just sitting there talking to him and said, well, Henry, what do you think about this? And others, Crosby Field, one of our famous people, and so many others. I had the opportunity, and others on the staff, to work with. And that made the 30 years that I spent there as an employee feel like 30 months, which I think is, in my case, something very good to say about your work, because you have to like it to stay there that long.
Well, it sounds like you really enjoyed your work from what you've described here today. One of the other things that, you know, with your 30-year tenure, society has gotten so much more complex. What has society done during that term to automate what they're doing?
Well, of course, way back, several years ago, electric typewriters were a big improvement. And then we went to automatic print, setting of print, and then suddenly departments each got word processors, which was a major improvement. I can remember when I was doing the minutes for the board of directors for several years, even though Doris Flandorfer was there taking all the notes in shorthand, I made my own notes. After the meeting, she would type it up very rough. I would take it home and read them and use my notes, would cross out, add in, then go back and either redictate or give them to her to redo, and then look again, check them over, send them out to the president, say, is this okay? And they came back, and then we could reproduce them, either on a mimeograph then, or what have you. Now on when we got the word processor, good heavens, your rough came out, and as you know, all you do is you just on the rough do it, and go back to the machine, and in no time at all, it's done.
Right.
And when you mail out fax it to the president, it's finished. So it's been a great thing. I understand that we are thinking of changing some of our automatic print deal that we do for our major, well, for technical things and whatnot, not just minutes. It's going to be a whole new upgrade of that. It's going to be a big improvement.
Just the size of the society. I mean, the 23,000 members you talked about in the 60s, with just the dues and the correspondence between those members, and going up to now where we're over 50,000. It has to be a tremendous task on the staff to do all that. It took a very dedicated staff, I'm sure, to get that accomplished under your direction.
And without the automation, Charlie, they could never do it. As an example, I've been active on the Honors and Awards Committee, and there's nothing, if I don't get 40 or 50 biographies of candidates to look at, and not just me, but maybe in the whole committee. The boxes of them come in. somebody at staff has to sit there and make sure they come out right. And then when we review technical papers, the same thing goes all over again. And I keep saying that I hope we own paper stock. Because somehow, of course, the more automated you get, the more you produce.
That's correct. That's true.
And as you know, you don't save employees. You have to add one, which is good, too. Now, that's probably one of the biggest improvements we've made at staff level has been in that reproduction and distribution and getting the communication to the members.
Anything you might like to say to our viewers in closing remarks about your term as Executive Vice President?
Well, I think the one thing I can say, Charlie, to anybody who sees this is that I feel fortunate in having been able to work for and with a tremendous group of wonderful people, and to see the benefits of their labor, which in almost every case is another person doing work without pay. That's what makes the whole organization run. When you come to a meeting and see literally thousands of people who come because of what we are providing them, something must be being done right.
That's right, all without pay, all normally their own expense.
Well, somebody's paying part of it.
Right.
Of course. But many of us, when they retire, nobody pays it. No, that's right. It's still that interest of people and the work's being done. It's a great organization.
Right indeed. I'd like to thank you for being with us today and sharing with us the history of yourself and ASHRAE. And thank you very much.
It's been fun, Charlie. Thanks.